Did you know that at the end of the 19th century, a priest composed some of the most beautiful flamenco pieces for piano of his time? His name was Buenaventura Íñiguez. He was born in Navarra and lived many years in Seville, where he was organist of the cathedral. In episode 29 of the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco, I will tell you about him, and you will also be able to listen to some of his flamenco compositions, some of them very virtuosic.
Sounds that once were listened. Sounds that once were enjoyed. Sounds that once were danced. Sounds relegated to oblivion. And yet, there is still something we can do for them. Let us summon them. Let us summon them.
Welcome to the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco. My name is José Miguel Hernández Jaramillo, and I invite you to enroll in this journey through the sounds, stories, spaces, and people that were part of the 19th century flamenco. Hi again to this podcast where we can remember some of the stories, characters, and sounds of the nascent flamenco still in the last decades of the 19th century, quite different from what we know today and fascinating and surprising. First of all, I want to thank you again because in this second season that has just begun, there is a notable increase of the number of people who is following this podcast. The last episode about how flamenco guitarists had to invent new accompaniments when new songs were being incorporated into flamenco, it has broken the record of listeners in the first 2 weeks of broadcast. So thank you so much. If you have not yet listened to this episode, you can do it in several podcast platforms as Spotify, iTunes, iVoox, Google Podcasts, or the YouTube channel Sonidos Olvidados en Musicología Creativa, where in addition to listen to each episode, you can also watch some of the contents. Remember that you can also follow us on social media as Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook. In today's episode, we will remember a character who does not appear in flamenco stories either, as is usual in this podcast, but who composed some exciting and beautiful flamenco works. I am referring to Buenaventura Íñiguez from Sangüesa in Navarra, born in 1840. He began his musical training from a very young age and continued once he entered the seminary. Buenaventura was obtained a priest and dedicated the rest of his life to ecclesiastical musical life. He worked as an organist in several cities, but especially in Seville, when he was the titular organist from 1865 until he died in 1902, 37 years in total. He also used to be the organist of the convent of Santa Inés, also in Seville. This convent of Santa Inés was near to my school, so I remember when I was a child to go to the upper floors and look out to see the cloistered nuns walking through the cloister. He was a disciple of Hilarión el Slava, who was a very renowned musician in Spain at that time. In a press article, Joaquín Guichot says the following about Buenaventura Íñiguez. Mr. Íñiguez is a musician of intelligence, feeling, and heart. He loves art as art. He never belittled or bastardized it. In addition to being an organist and composer, he participated as judge in some composition competitions. He was also actively involved in some musical and cultural institutions such as the Sevillian Auxiliary Board of the Scientific, Literary and Artistic Athenaeum, of which he became the president. He composed many religious works and some methods for organ or singing. What is not well known is that he also composed non-religion works such as an opera, a symphony titled La Española, some instrumental and bold pieces such as valses, nocturnes, polonaises, and above all, what concerns us in this podcast, some Andalusian and flamenco pieces. I know 3 of them: the Malagueñas Jaleadas from 1878, Echoes of Andalucía presented in May 1880, and a potpourri of Spanish airs titled Cantos Españoles from 1885, which contains, among others, Soleá, Jaleo, Jaleo de Jerez, Malagueñas, Seguidillas or Sevillanas, El Vito, El Olé, Fandangos, Peteneras or Tangos. From the dedications of the last works, we know that he also had some disciples to whom he taught the piano. For example, in the Malagueñas Jaleadas has the following commitment: to my disciples Mrs. Amparo Espinosa and Mrs. Micaela Palacios. And in Cantos Españoles he dedicates it to my distinguished disciple Miss Rosario de la Vega y González de Rojas. Do you want to listen to these flamenco works composed by this priest, organist of the Sevillian Cathedral? Let's start with the Malagueñas Jaleadas, which is the work we are listening to now. It is a very long piece, lasts about 14 minutes, and it's impressive. It is full of virtuosic moments and contains 3 songs from the Malagueñas. In his time, the writer Joaquín Guichot commented in the article I mentioned before that these Malagueñas are the delight of fans of this genre of national music. Let's listen to a little bit of this incredible work. Buenaventura Íñiguez also composed another Malagueñas as part of the work Cantos Españoles. As I mentioned before, it is a potpourri or a piece consisting of fragments of other pieces. This type of composition was prevalent then, especially taking fragments from some geographical region. In this work, Cantos Españoles, that we can translate as Spanish songs, some works are not specifically flamenco, such as the Parranda from Murcia, Zortzicos, Boleros, etc. But most of the pieces are Andalusian or flamenco pieces. We are hearing the Soleá included in this work. After the Soleá is included the Jaleo, which, although it is very similar to the Soleá, was well differentiated at that time. If you remember, episode 22 of this podcast was dedicated to Jaleo. This song was no longer practiced in flamenco since the beginning of the 20th century. If you haven't heard it yet, I recommend you to do it. You can listen to it in your favorite podcast platform, as I mentioned before. Be careful, don't confuse the Jaleo with the next work in the potpourri, called the Jaleo de Jerez, which was composed in the 1840s and, as you can hear, is a little bit different from the Jaleo. The last three pieces of the work are the fandango, the petenera, and the tango. We are listening to the fandango, which also contains a singing part, which is the following. I mention this because not all fandangos of that time contained this singing part. Instead, they were instrumental pieces or dedicated to dancing, as I mentioned in episode 25 of this podcast. The petenera that follows contains both the most common copla or singing part until 1881 and the copla so-called Nueva Petenera, New Petenera, which became very popular in 1881. In a future episode, I will tell you about the different types of peteneras that emerged in the beautiful time called flamenquismo or flamencomania, which covered the last decades of the 19th century. Finally, the tango also follows the characteristic patterns of the tangos at that time. Note that the configuration of the tango that we know today occurs a couple of decades after this composition. This tango is in minor mode and its rhythmic structure differs from the current flamenco tangos. Let's listen to it so you can understand it. Well, this has been a quick review of the flamenco legacy that Buenaventura Íñiguez left us. Today, I think it could be unthinkable for a priest to participate in the Sevillian Flamenco Bienal or Festival de Jerez or any other flamenco event, and also to compose some virtuosic flamenco works. This makes us reflect on how different flamenco was 140 years ago, with much more openness in many aspects, compared to the flamenco of the 20th century, even in the 21st. It is not the first time that we have seen in this podcast how flamenco lacked so many restrictions and rules of what is good or what is not good, what is flamenco or what is not flamenco, and so on. We still have a lot to discover about that flamenco. It will be easier the more open our minds are to understand its enormous relevance in Spain and abroad, as we saw in episode 27. That's why I invite you to follow this podcast every 15 days, either in English or Spanish on the sister podcast Sonidos Olvidados del Flamenco, and that you subscribe to it on any of the leading podcast platforms. Remember that you can also follow us on social media. Have a great time, and I'll be waiting for you here in 2 weeks.